with recovering nature, you start to feel tearful. And when you hear descriptions like that, you feel tearful because there's something missing in most of our lives. And I'm not sure, actually, this part of the world is not, it's got pretty full on nature, I'm guessing. So Dartmoor, I don't know it well enough, and I'm not sure how it's going, but I'm sure that the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about is going to be a slightly more degraded landscape than Dartmoor, but I don't know. I've just been staying with some friends near Bridport, and we've been looking around one of the little farms, 200-acre farms along the coastline there, with this incredible scrubland, and we were walking over these swards that were just full of, this time of year, no flowers or anything, but you could just tell how incredible these swards were. It was just so uplifting. And the farmer, the organic farmer, taken on the lease about 15 years ago of this bit of land, has got some ruby red Devons grazing it. He's randomising his grazing. He's absolutely loving what he's got and what he's looking after and what he's creating. So you get these lovely little sweet spots everywhere, don't you? And the more you become used to seeing landscapes and looking at landscapes, so you start to see the little gems, but also you start to see the degradation and the loss. And that's what I'm going to hopefully describe, where I think the changes we can do and have happen to our landscapes and how that's going to fit into Britain and England and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rewilding itself. A little bit about myself. I stood down as chair of Rewilding Britain about 5-6 months ago, I guess. I'd been there as chair for 3 or 4 years. Started it up, as it were, part of the whole gang that made the thing into what it is. That's been a really interesting move for me, because suddenly what I was then doing was entering the boards of a whole lot of NGOs all around the world, and also being part of philanthropic giving all around the world. So it's taken me down a completely new route in my life. But we'll come back to that as well, because I think it's important to think about what we can all do and how we can make a change. My buttons, here we are. Okay. So this is a view from the top turret of the castle in the middle of a Repton Park. And this landscape here is, this green field in front of the lake would have been ploughed in my grandparents' era. So it's not been looking like this for very long. That tree in there, it had died about 30 years ago, and it still stands there today. It looks exactly the same as that. And it's a totem to change, a totem to a new way of thinking. What's rewilding? Of course, rewilding is about apex predators and trophic cascades. Of course it is. One of the things that I suppose we've got to think about is what sort of landscape are we going to allow these animals back into our lives in? Do we need to not restore enough of our landscape so that there's enough natural habitat for these animals to be back in? So that's a question mark, and that's maybe something that perhaps the next generation or the generation after are going to be able to answer. I think things like lynx we can do now. We can get those back into our landscapes right now. We can do the wild cat, we can do the pine marten, we can do a whole lot of stuff. But perhaps the brown bear and the wolf is not quite here yet. And it's really people that I'm saying that about, because I don't think we're here yet. I think we've gone so far down a different route that we aren't ready for this sort of thing. Now, we're leaving Europe as well, perhaps, and that makes it even more difficult, because the Europeans are becoming more and more used to these animals. We have twice as many wolves in Europe than they have in North America. We have 10 times as many brown bears as they have in North America. And those animals are living amongst quite big populations. 62 wolf packs now in Germany. So I think for me, we need to restore habitats, we need to give more space to nature, and eventually we'll get to a point when we can start to think really seriously about allowing these things back in our lives. Always good to start with a graph. So this is John Lawton's cartoon, and John in 2012 wrote this report, the More, Bigger, Better, Joined Up, the Space for Nature report. And that report is what we're basically working on at the moment. We've got a new environmental 25-year plan, we've got a new agriculture bill, which have both collapsed because we've lost the parliament. But those two things are being fed from this original report from John. And this was him trying to work out in his own head what he thought rewilding was. So you've got, on the left-hand side, you've got management, so getting higher and higher management, and then you've got scale. And we're talking about 10 to the power of 5 here. So we're talking about enormous scale here. The Palesi is 5.4 million hectares. It's the land that runs from Chernobyl, exclusion zone, all the way up to, along the Belarusian and Ukrainian border, all the way up to Bay of Asia forest, almost hitting that. So these are vast areas down here. These are wildernesses. And where we are is up here. So we've got 1 hectare, 10 hectares, 100 hectares. That's where we're clustered. So that's our little pockets of nature. That's what we've got left. I have a lot of NGOs coming to Knepp, and one of the questions I've always asked is, what's the average size of your nature reserve? And it's usually 16, 20 hectares. That's what we're talking about here. So the NGOs that we have put in charge of looking after a lot of our nature are looking after tiny little pockets of specific things that they're highly managed for. So they're looking after little tiny pockets. There's one, I don't know how many of you come across Bill Sutherland. Bill has a seat in Cambridge, he's a professor of Cambridge, and one of the things he shows people around when they want to see what the state of nature is in Britain is to come and have a look at a yellow mugwort in the outskirts of Cambridge. Now this nature reserve is about as big as this room, and this plant is pretty well extinct from the landscape now. It's gone. And what it needs is a whole lot of disturbance. It basically needs cattle and bison ripping up the ground, and then this plant can survive. So the thought is that you've got to look after that mugwort. You've got to keep hold of it long enough until you give it more space. Once you give it more space and you start to establish that plant back into a landscape, you can then start relaxing. And that means scale. That means you need to have lots of scale, and you need to be able to give that key habitat for that particular plant somewhere within that scale, some chance of propagating, survival, and going into the future. So this idea that scale matters, John's bigger, better, more, and joined up, is the idea that we keep hold of these little pockets of nature long enough until society has given back more space to nature. Rewilding is the term that we're just calling, this is a journey. If you've rewilded, you've reached wilderness. That's the end of the journey. You've rewilded. It's wilderness. Now, that's a problem for Britain, because we can't get here. It's too big. These two bigger areas. So there's always going to be people in intervention in cultural landscapes and so on. So we're always going to be on a journey. We're always going to be trying to get bigger and bigger and less management. And that's the sort of picture that rewilding should be conjuring in your heads. It's a journey. You can start from very small areas and you can get bigger and bigger, and you are on a journey. You are rewilding. 1,400 hectares, 3,500 acres in the Weald, in the Low Weald in Sussex. So we're crammed between Crawley, Horsham, London, Brighton, Hove, that sort of area. We're on, there's chalk downs either side of us, and then we're on this big 320 metres of clay cap over a bedrock of ironstone and limestone, 10-acre fields, lots of little waterways running through that landscape, but really, really poor agricultural land. This is my father, my 2 aunts and my uncle, and they're witnessing the ripping up of the 20 years of abandonment between the wars. So that last agricultural depression for our part of the Weald was abandonment. We only had the home farm on 3,500 acres still running and functioning as a farm. All the rest of that land had been abandoned, and scrub had grown back into that landscape. So I'm not really going to be talking about very much new stuff. I'm just going to be saying, well, the new way of thinking is to use drivers to drive this system that you then create with scrub. But it's old hat. It's all part of our landscape. It's what happened the last time we had an agricultural depression. This is the Canadian Army in front of the castle, and this Repton Park was all ploughed up. And it was that period of time, that after the war, that 9 years of guarantee, we then started to guarantee prices for food and so on, so with the subsidy started. And to plough up and to grow crops in areas that never had before, you were sainted. You were thought to be doing your bit for the country. So sainted if you got 2 blades of grass growing where one blade grew before. Nancy is now 24. She's got her degree in marine biology. This is me sitting on top of a pile of wheat. I actually grew up on a farm in Broadhembury, just near Holland. So I'm sort of Devon born, really. When I came here when I was about 7, and I stayed until I was about 15. So I sort of came from there, then I went on to Cirencester and did that, and then I took over the family estate when I was 21. And then I took over the farm when I was 23. So very young going into this, but I thought I knew everything. And this is actually when we really, I thought we cracked it. We were sitting on a pile of wheat, and the weather had been fantastic. The green pound had been fantastic. Everything went well, and we made £500,000. And thought, great, we know how to do this now. We can march on and we can produce food, and that's great. Again, collapsing green pound and whatever happened, everything then disaster. And our land looks like this. And this is the attitude that we had. I had. My grandparents had. It was about trying to make the enterprises you were running on your land profitable. And if you had bloody trees in the middle of your field, you ploughed up underneath them until they died. And then you didn't feel guilty because you're not causing it, because they've just died. And then you remove it, and then you can get your combine up and down the field properly. So for me, nature didn't belong in this landscape. I wasn't thinking about nature. I was just thinking about how am I going to deal with the next call from the bank manager. So you're just not thinking that way. You're thinking about other things. You're not thinking about nature. The blue line is Knepp's winter wheat averages over 72 to 99. And then the green line is the UK national average for winter wheat. Incidentally, I just met a high wheel farmer just the other day, and he's on the high wheel, we're on the low wheel. He was just half a ton shy of the world record, and that was on clay, and I was just so gobsmacked by this guy, because what I'm telling you is I couldn't do anything like the world record. 16.5 tons per hectare is the world record in 2016. So here we are, eight for the national average, by the end of the 90s was 8.7 tonnes, and we were just under 7 tonnes a hectare. Now, for those of you farming, you need to be, depending on your farming system, 8.5 to 10 tonne a hectare to make money without subsidy at the moment. So we're probably 2 tonnes light of making a profit without subsidy. And that, of course, means that you're just spending your subsidy, because it's coming in anyway, to achieve what? And that's really the main point. So one of the things that we then started to face with by the end of the 90s is, what are we going to do? If we're just going to be doing commodities, we're never going to be able to compete. So what sort of commodities can we then produce? And we couldn't find anything that would grow on our land. So what about nature? We were also producing lots of milk, so we had 3.5 million litres of milk. We had bought a lot of milk quota. We had set up a whole new dairy system. We got rid of our red poles. We had gone into Holstein Friesian herds, so on, so on, so on. We spent millions on doing it. And for a while, we were making a bit of money, and then it started to collapse. And I got very nervous around the end of the 90s. Milk prices were collapsing. There was talk about milk quota going. We had spent a lot of money on buying milk quota. So we then thought, well, okay, bite the bullet. If we're going to have to spend another $1.2 million to revamp our dairies, which we're about to have to do, let's think about what we could do with that money in a different way. Along came Franz Führer. Franz's book was translated in English in 2000. So Grazing Ecology and Forest History was the book that then we based a lot of the thinking that we've come up with since. So Franz is my hero, and I look to him as someone who is a mentor and a guide throughout all of this. He is extraordinary, Franz. He was employed by the Dutch government as a blue sky thinker. Now, how many roles do you think we need to put in our government for a blue sky? What a title! Get someone clever. Let's think out of the box. What are we going to do? Franz's book, though, was talking about if we're going to manage for nature, and we don't quite know how nature actually functions and works, how are you going to manage for nature? That was his question mark. His big question. What are you going to do if you're going to try to manage for nature and you don't quite know how it all functions? Should we not play around with how it functions so we can then come up with some answers? One of the things we then looked at with Franz and others, by now I had set up an advisory board, and so we had about 25 people sitting on it as a cohort of people interested in doing what we set out to do, which was to ring fence the whole lot and to have some animals roaming around and follow the sort of hypothesis of Vera's hypothesis. So one of the things you then start to do is you start to look at what were the species within our landscape that started to make differences, drive systems. So this is the ice sheet melting and slowly animals following the grasses, the trees then following the animals. How did those animals shape the landscape? And so you need to know what animals were in the landscape. Now in Dartmoor, there'll be some really wacky good collections from the Victorian period, and you need to go and have a look at that. I know Derek Gower's in the audience, and one thing he always does when he goes anywhere, he finds the historical references. He goes along to those wacky little museums with the weird stuffed animals in them, and you can go and look in the jars and you see what was there, what was present. So you start then finding out about your landscape and learning about that. One of the things that has been really difficult for Franz and the whole idea of these landscapes is the palynologists. So these are taking core samples out of different spots around the countryside, and then you count pollen every 2 centimetres, you count all the pollen within that core sample, and then you can tell what plants were present. Well, you can tell some of the plants are present. So a lot of the plants aren't obviously wind pollinated. Some of the plants aren't going to show up at all in that core sample. And for 80, 90 years, we've been stuck in this evidence-based of what our landscape looked like before humans, and then as humans came in, this column tells a different story. Now you've got people like Ralph Fife, and others like him who have now put back and truthed all those core samples by putting back things like hazel. Hazel was too common to count, so they removed it. As you all know, hazel is a light-demanding species. It won't produce flowers unless it has light, so it's actually a scrubland species, not an understory wood species. Now, I'm telling you all this is because if you're going to do something like this, you've got to get into it. You've got to understand some of the thinking behind it, so that you can start to read your landscape that you're going to be managing or looking after, or persuading other people to look after. So they put back all this data, they then redid all the information, and what they were coming up with was really interesting stuff. So we're now thinking that 1/3 of our landscape was open. That's very different, isn't it? You know, if you go to Alan Titchmarsh and his BBC, you know, this country was covered in a deep dark forest, man came along, cut it down, opened it up, biodiversity poured in, man is the creator. In this system, he wasn't. And that's a bit tough for people to get used to. So 1/3 open, 1/3 understory, he calls it, but maybe he's meaning scrubland, because he's then putting in hazel and things, which are light demanding species. And then the other 1/3 closed canopy. Now, if that is how a natural system works, this is 6,000 years before present, If that's how our natural system works, then how do we then get that balance right? And the balance is so precarious. So the farmer I was with this morning, he has to intervene. He's only got cattle. It's all going to close up and become thick scrub, and then trees. So he's got to intervene the whole time. He's got to manage. It's only 200 acres. He hasn't got deer. He hasn't got bison. He hasn't got elk. He hasn't got. So one of the things that we then started to look at was, well, what choices can we have to drive a system on Knepp? And you pretty well knock out a whole load of species because they're all extinct. They're gone. But you've got the descendants of the cattle, and you've got the descendants of the horses. And you can use them. The mouthpieces, their stomachs, the way that they herd, the way that they move around landscapes. You've also got a choice with elk. Well, 1,400 hectares in southern England ain't big enough for an elk. So you discard that. Wild boar, well, they're part of the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, so you can't use them. You've got footpaths and so on. You can't introduce an animal that could be dangerous to people. Not that red deer aren't dangerous and a lot of the other animals not dangerous, but that's the thinking. So you can use a proxy for that as well. So that's the sort of thinking that you go through. Okay, we came up with this list of animals that we could then reintroduce. The Tamworth pig has given us, we think, the only growing population of turtle doves in the UK. We think it's also given us the largest population of purple emperor butterflies in the UK. We know that it's given us space for all those little biennial annual plants that have been sprayed out from our landscape. We know that it's giving us space for the solitary bees and the wasps that need broken open ground. This is a keystone species. One 230 kilo sow will plough up 60 acres. So if your average size of your nature reserve is 30 acres, how many pigs? Your heavy hitters, your fighters, you've got this vegetation succession going on, and you're needing a heavy hitter. Now, we all know about the damage these animals do in closed canopy woodland, taking out the understory. But how did it function before? How did the system work when we weren't pushing all nature into these closed canopy woodland plantations? Just posing a question there. So these animals on Knepp, you won't get a empty browse line in this scrub. It fights back. It's able to cope with about 700 deer. And these are very important for keeping the system going, keeping that scrub at bay, that it's not going to take over completely and turn into a closed canopy wood. You then got your Exmoor ponies. We've chosen Exmoors. And you've got teeth on the top, you've got a single stomach, you've got a different herd structure, you've got different ways of moving around landscapes, you've got different viruses carried in the teeth of the animal. You've got differences that we don't know of. We know the research that's been done on what happens if you have horses present with cattle feeding on the same bit of land. You can get better growth rates on your cattle if you've got horses present or not, than not. So you know all this sort of stuff, but you're not quite sure what they're doing. But you sort of want them to be part of that mixture, and you think that something is being given to the whole project by them, but you're not sure about it. Old English Longhorns, lots of stomachs. 230 different plant species are known to be carried around the landscape by these animals on their hooves, in their fur, in their gut. These are really important vectors, disturbers, movers, shakers. They're not just eating grasses. They spend a lot of their time browsing. You know, when you put an old breed into a field and it walks straight to the hedge and starts eating the hedge rather than the grass, that's what you're buying into here. You're going back in time to get one of these old breeds that then will give you some of those traits that you're wanting to see again. My Holsteins would not survive in this landscape. So it's going to be a little bit more complicated story here, because the landscape is split into three main blocks, and those three main blocks are divided by roads. So you've got the northern block, middle block, and the southern block. That's a sort of cultural landscape. That's the Repton Parky bit. And then you've got the northern block up there and the southern block. The northern block, we've only got cattle in. We haven't put any of the heavy browsers or the pigs in there. And what's happened to that landscape is that it's stayed pretty well parkland. It's just beginning now to scrub up. There's a bit of scrub coming through. Grasses suppress all the exuberant explosion of woody shrubs and trees. It just suppresses it. So just cattle up there, nothing else, no horses. We were thinking that we'd do it for 5 years and then we'd have an explosion of stuff coming back in there, and then we would put the big heavy hitters in, the deer. But it just hasn't happened. It's just tripping along very slowly. So when we were talking to the National Trust 2 or 3 years ago, it was thought to be, well, if you wanted to do it on slow-mo and not frighten the neighbours, then this is probably a good way of doing it. You reseed all your arable ground with grasses, suppresses all the scrub. You start to get quite good swards of quite complex species mixes, but it doesn't look and isn't behaving as the really A-grade stuff, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So then you've got the cultural landscape. You've got this area around the castle. So you've got a Repton Park, you've got all the historic parts of the park, you're keeping vistas open, you're planting trees and tree guards where Repton had his, so you're treating it more like a traditional park. But it's still grassland. It's been reseeded with really complex mixes of grasses, which all failed. It all reverted to Yorkshire fog and white clover. And that's from a mix of grasses, about 38 different species. So, it's a failure. It's not been hugely successful in terms of bringing lots of wildlife back. It's a big grassland area. It's good for the white storks. Then the southern block. Now this is the biggest area. This is 1,100 acres for those who are still working in acres. And this is a complex area. We came out over 6 years. We dropped out of arable farming over a 6-year period. And then we had another 3 years before we actually built our ring fence. So 9 years before we could put any of the big herbivores in it. And during that 9-year period, you had this explosion of scrub, of trees, of stuff. And that explosion wasn't checked until the 9th year in, when we got our fence up, and then we put all these animals in, and then you started to see the interaction between animal and plant. And that's where you have the description of the landscape looking a little bit like Africa. It becomes to look like Africa because it's got free roaming animals out there driving a system. Another thought, I suppose, to think about, vegetation pulses and how to describe them. One of the easiest ones I heard from an African was that in 1860 the Boers brought rinderpest into southern Africa. 40, 30, 70 million animals died. We're not talking about the cattle, we're talking about the animals that were indigenous to Africa. So you had this huge die-off. You then had a vegetation pulse because there was nothing eating this stuff. So when you go to the Ngorongoro and you're standing under the Mapanis, which are towering over your head, and there's not much of an understory, what you're looking at is an 1870 die-off from a disease. And the same with Serengeti. So one of the thoughts you can sort of think about is that what we did is we had a die-off, arable, and then you had this vegetation pulse, and then you had the animals that you were bringing in driving a system that was new, a new habitat. So it's not trying to look back in the past and recreate a habitat of the past. It's a habitat you're wanting to create for the future. It's a new habitat. And you can see all the little pathways where all the animals are going, and that becomes more and more like Africa. One of the things that this spring we did a survey of 1,100 acres, and what they were doing was looking at every breeding site for every bird on 1,100 acres. And so they were using techniques, and we went out 5 times and counted every single bird in that landscape and mapped it. What they think is they found a new baseline. We haven't seen that many birds crammed into a landscape as we have this spring. So it's a new baseline. So one of the things that really interests me is this shifting baseline syndrome. And a lot of you will be now aware of this, but it's sort of worth just recapping on it. Shifting baseline syndromes is this idea that each generation goes forward, knows where the good hotspots are in the world that they've seen and love, and they hanker after the rest of the landscape to look like that. But they have no idea what they've lost from the past. So this is an idea of continuous loss, and you never quite know. You never, because you can't believe when you hear someone say there used to be lapwings in every field. You just what they say, they don't look like that now. I can't quite believe it. These are a series of photographs of a boat going out from Florida, and it's catching fish, and it's over a period of 30, 40 years. So it's the same family that run the boat out of a key in Florida, and it's recording what they've caught over those 30, 40 years. So back in the 50s, these are giant gropers, and you can target giant gropers because they all club together in spawning grounds in one particular time of year. So you can go and target them, you can wipe them out. The apex predator you can wipe out. Still in the 50s, still these huge fish, beginning to change, but still big numbers and still huge fish. This is the 60s and 70s. Beginning to change completely now. The last groper, you've got the yellowfin groper, that maybe that's the last of that one as well. But your snappers and everything else take over the reef system, and everything changes. So this is a sort of typical 2000 catch now in the West Keys, and that I suppose is this is not terrestrial. But it just gives you a great feeling of we just don't have an idea of what we lost. We just don't understand it. One of the things I'm trying to get my head around is people like John Lawton, the Wildlife Trusts and their Living Landscapes and the RSPB's work is all about this idea that we've got to do something about the degraded landscapes. We've got to put back in these degraded landscapes something that is more interesting and more vibrant. I'm not asking you to read all this. These are just thoughts. When I look at a picture like this now, this is the sort of things that pop into my head. Monoculture, insecticides, no hedges, nowhere for life ready to live in this landscape. And it's a random picture from the internet. So it's there's a canalised river system, there's a big motorway and a B road, there's a town in the distance, and there's maybe it's the Chilterns in the distance. I don't know. So how do we see this future? The Dieter Helm future, the thinking now from the 25-year environment plan year. And that's what I'm just going to run through, just to show you what I'm thinking, how this whole thing works. Well, we know what is going on. We know that it isn't business as usual. We've got to change. We've got to change because we do not want to see the complete collapse in our ecosystem. We need to rebuild enough of it, to have enough of it to pass on. So we know we can't go on as we are. So how can we change? Well, where does rewilding fit into this landscape? I've sort of put a whole lot of my stalks kettling over a bit of misty sort of ground over here, which is meant to tell you that's all insects rising from it. And that's your rewilding patch, and that's probably based around some pockets of really good nature anyway. You've got some good little pockets you'll carry on managing. Those are going to spill out into a rewilded landscape, and that rewilded landscape is going to be run by something. It's going to be run by herbivores. It's on a scale that is big enough to be able to do that. But what about the rest of this landscape? And you notice instantly, I'm not saying that we should rewild the whole bloody country. It's not what I'm saying. These linear corridors, this connectivity they talk about, this physical connection, They need to be big enough, they need to be bold enough, they need to be strong enough and resilient enough to take on some of the role of where nature's going to sit in our landscapes and how it's going to move in our landscapes. With climate change, we need to be able to go northeast, southwest, we need to be able to move. But we've got the problem of the fragmented landscape. So we've got to, I think, in my book, start putting some bridges in. And I don't know if you know, I was down in Kent talking to 90 farmers, and I said that there was two green bridges in Britain, and I was corrected. They said 1.5, because the half one is not really working or functioning. We got 2. So we're talking about 62 in Holland, for instance. They're expensive, so we need to be careful where they go, and we need to think about how we can fund those things. There was a £65 million fund that was here, sitting in England from Europe, waiting to be spent on exactly this 2 years ago. I applied for it. My road was owned by county, not national, so I couldn't get it. And I was going to connect myself up with a 7,000-acre estate on the other side of the road. So I think we need to think about how we can reconnect. But these linear lines, that connectivity can be run with animals. It can be productive, it can be producing, it can be a net model. Hedges, well, you've got fantastic hedges in Devon. Maybe a bit too many cut before the winter, but you've got fantastic hedges. But we have got huge areas in our countryside where you're just arable farming and you don't give a damn about the hedge. Well, the hedges is in the way. It's maybe a convenient place to have a drainage ditch, but that's about it. And they're cut to the quick, straight after harvest, and they're really pretty well ignored. So having hedges back as part of the linear progression of the bloodline of this landscape, where you can start feeding from your rewilding areas and your nature areas back into the landscape, is going to be very important. When we got to 7 metres at the base wide, the nightingales came. So 7 metres seemed to be the critical point, and then 14 metres, 15 metres, nightingales still there. So these are 3 nightingale territories on this 170 metre long stretch of hedgerow. It's now about 14 metres wide. It's got a ditch in the bottom, and it is fantastic habitat for everything. We put up refugia tins for the normal person all along here to count the slow worms and the snakes, and the most I've ever found is 25 slow worms and 3 grass snakes under 1 tin. Huge numbers of stuff. Love that linear, scalloped edged hedge. So let's do something about our hedges. Now a lot of places I've been going to have been attempting to do these margins around fields and so on, but there's been 3 really good examples of actually how to do it really well. And one of them is quite close to us, and it's on the Norfolk estate in Sussex. So it's on the Arundel estate called Peppering. One of the things that the RSPB did about 5 years ago is they funded, it came out 5 years ago, they funded this really brilliant report, and they looked at a 1,000-hectare site, and for 6 years they monitored it, and they pulled out, I think, 8% of the landscape was given back to nature. Total yield from the 1,000 hectares went up by 34%. So we're not talking about giving away margin or profit, or it is about if we pull nature back into our system, and this is on a conventional farming system, so the middle of the field would have been done with conventional farming. It wasn't sort of the new generation of conservation agriculture or regenerative agriculture. It was a bog standard system in the middle of the field, and then you had all these sacrificial crops around, and so on and so on and so on. So they can be hugely successful. This is the Peppering landscape on the top of the downs, and what Eddie Norfolk has done is he's divided his 150-acre fields into 30 acres. And he's put a hedge on the top of each of these little banks that he's created, and then he's farmed with oilseed rape here, oilseed rape over here, wheat here, and the farm manager hates him. But the farm manager is compensated because what he's now got into is the fact that all these bird species are rocketing, and he's feeling bloody proud about it. Now, Eddie's a shooting man, so he's actually looking after this site for his partridges. He started off with 11 pairs. He's now got 2,000 pairs on that bit of ground. So we can farm for nature. Now, regenerative agriculture and conservation agriculture, and in England it's called conservation agriculture, and the rest of the world is called regenerative agriculture. I don't know how many of you come across this term yet. Yes? Lots of you? I sit on the board, it's sort of an advisory board on a large farming operation. We have 110,000 hectares around the planet. And we farm everything from milk to nuts to avocados to, name it, we grow it. And we've decided as a company that we won't be putting any synthetic pesticides on any of our land by 2030. And it's because of the evidence coming out of this movement, the regenerative agriculture movement. Now, I put these books up here as a bit of further reading. You've got David Montgomery's book, which is based on sort of North American examples, including Gabe Brown, his book here, Dirt to Soil. And then you've got The Call of the Rewilding, Charlie Massey's book on all the things that are going on in Australia. And if you're into this sort of thing, they're really cool things to start to get into. And obviously Alan Savory's holistic management as well, which I can't quite understand myself, but anyway, I'm sure someone does. So if we can move over to a regenerative agricultural system and restore our soils, this is probably the most important thing of anything I'm going to say. If we can do that, then everything will follow, I'm guessing. If we can restore our soils on the bits and pieces that we are farming, then everything will follow. We will start to think differently because we'll be thinking about soils and we'll be thinking about what else is needed to be done in our landscape. I think we need a little bit more wood pasture. I love wood pasture, and at the moment you can get £409 a hectare for the next 10 years on creating wood pasture exactly how we've done it, through natural regeneration. £109 a hectare. I don't know what sort of margins you're making up on that one. Water. Now, we all know Derek's in the room. And Derek is the authority on this particular species. I've put in 2 of Derek's beaver dams in this particular river system. I couldn't get the cloning tool to turn this river into a meandering river. But we just know doing this sort of thing just is instant. Life pours back into re-wetted systems. At Knepp we did a 2.5 kilometre long, this is the old river system, big canal along here, and then we went in with big machines and we churned it all up and we re-meandered and filled in the old canalised river system, and then it's now becoming this lovely sort of braided wetland. And we've planted a whole lot of trees now, and we've now made an application to introduce beavers, and we hope the beavers will cut down all our trees and make dams and start to get that whole floodplain dynamic again. So we know we've got to do this. We've got to do this over large areas of our countryside. Slow down water. We've just been having another flood event, haven't we? Last one, I suppose, is trees and tree planting. Now, a bit of a campaign is Izzy and I running, which is we've got to think very carefully about the £500 million that we're about to spend on planting the northern forest. If we're going to plant it with trees brought in mostly from Holland, in plugs with tubes and all the rest of it, I think we are going to end up with a disaster. I don't know if you're very unlikely to have heard of Purpose. It was a £3.5 million project funded by DEFRA, looking at diseases, in particular in oak, but it was also looking at diseases in general in trees. And one of the things that struck me, I went along as a keynote listener, so I sort of had to give a 10-minute talk at the end of this day, listening to all these scientists. And one of the key things that I heard from these people was this terrifying thought that 1/5 of all our oaks will be gone by 2050. 1/5 of all our oaks. If we keep on planting trees with maybe 1 or 2 or 3 mycorrhizal fungi injected into the peat that the acorn has grown in a nursery in Holland, and plonk that into a field in Cumbria, how resilient do you think that tree is going to be for disease? And that's what, so when I was doing my 10-minute at the end, that's what I was saying. Well, what's the science about, how resilient will our trees be if they are planted in that way versus allowing trees to come naturally? And the answer is they are able to fight disease much better if they are natural regeneration. So half a billion spent on tree planting, I would say a lot of that's going to have to be natural regeneration. And what does that mean? How are we going to do that? And that's, again, a net model. You just pull your foot off the numbers of grazing and browsing animals and just go into a woodland. So trees. So that's the sort of landscape that, I'm talking about. That's the sort of landscape that the Wildlife Trust is talking about. That's the sort of landscape that the RSPB is talking about. It's the sort of landscape that I think that we'll all want. And how's it going to be paid for? Some of the things that, I don't know how many of you have read Dieter Helm's latest book. I tried Natural Capital and went on 7 holidays and brought it back unread. But his latest book, I don't know if you've read Green and Prosperous Land. How many of you read that? Okay, so not many. So I would read that. I would read that because he's the chairman of the Natural Capital Committee, and the Natural Capital Committee is set up to advise government and particularly the 25-year environment plan. And if you read his book, it's so bloody radical that you will just open up your mind to a whole load of stuff that I had never thought about. So I would definitely read Green and Prosperous Land. It's a very, we got to break a lot of eggs here, and we've got to change a whole lot of systems. And I think Dieter's got some of the ideas, and there's lots of other people that have got some amazing ideas as well. But I think that's the sort of direction of travel that we're going to have to go in to get this sort of landscape. One of the things that we did a bit of work on was working on, the government has come up with a 40 pounds a tonne, a carbon equivalent tonne payment. And so these are the sorts of figures that we were then looking at. So marine, if you stop dredging and trawling, you can then start to capture maybe 4 tonnes a hectare per year. When you've got your species-rich grassland, you have 3.6 tonnes a year. Trees, 12.8. Wetlands, this is very generic. It's not precise stuff, but it's good enough. And we then started Rewilding Britain. We had a parliamentary question that we got 100,000 signatures in about a week. And we then had a debate in Parliament just recently, just as the whole thing collapsed, and so wasn't really seen or heard. But what we were talking about was then how do you monetize this? So at £40 a tonne, you're sort of talking about that sort of money payment per year for carbon sequestration. So your peats and bogs and heathland, £292. Woodland, 512, species-rich grassland, 144, salt marsh, offshore, £161 a hectare per year. So some of these thoughts that government are having are going to be quite interesting. This will be part of the mix, I'm guessing, of a future payments for services. So we know that these landscapes get flooded by life. And when I'm saying that we think that we've come up with a new baseline at Knepp on how many birds could be squeezed into this little scrubby 1,100 acres, that's astonishing. We've been recording birds for a very long time. So if you can start to think that actually we didn't even know that you could have that many birds in a landscape, it becomes even more exciting, isn't it? Tony here is one of the people that was doing this study this spring. I'm just showing you this just to give you an example. He caught 600 blackcaps in 5 days. Blackcaps and lesser whitethroat, he has recorded last year in 2.5 weeks, last autumn, he recorded in 2.5 weeks more than he had in his entire life's work on doing it. 30 years. So you go out into the scrubland in mid-May, beginning of May, at dawn, and your lungs are so full of noise. Noise is probably the biggest indicator of all, isn't it? If you hear noise, and the noise of life, and your breath is taken away just by the sheer volume of noise, you know something's happening. And that's what we're missing, it's the silence. Silent spring and all that. It really is the silence. And so when you go out with someone, who someone knows what they're bloody talking about, like Penny, our ecologist here, she'll take me out and then tell me what the hell all this noise is. But you don't give a damn. It's just noise. It's just life. And that feeling of life. Soil. So for Knepp, we never did any baseline surveys on our soil because 20 years ago no one was talking about soil. We didn't talk about soil. So what we've done is we've used my neighbour, next door neighbour, that I actually sold the land to, and so we know what the management of that land was before. We know that what he's done is carried on doing exactly what we were doing, and we're using his land as a baseline for what we've got. So our soil carbon has doubled, our organic carbon has doubled, our soil organic matter, I don't know what the difference is of all these things, but perhaps someone will tell me. Doubled, everything is feeling like it's really on its path to recovery. The balance between mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria have changed. It's gone towards the mycorrhizal fungi. So your soils are recovering, and that's hugely important. Because if you wanted to turn the clock back and actually go back into farming, you've just restored all the soil. I put this up because I'm sort of a bit of a dung beetle fanatic. I've spent many hours watching a bit of cowpat or horse dung falling to the ground and counting how many seconds it takes for different species of dung beetle to appear in the dung. It's fascinating. When you're 20, 30 seconds, plop, 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 and they sort of randomly drop out of the air and just bounce around and then rush into the dung. Fantastic to do. This is, we were looking at, this student was looking at the difference between organic farming and us. So we had 2 organic farms 6 miles away on the Weald. On the same day she went out and trapped dung beetles. She caught 12,178 dung beetles in all. On Knepp she did 11,677, and there were 2 organic farms of 580. Astonishing. Now, part of the secret there is there's a whole lot of species that you get that are specialised in particular dung. So if you've only got cattle or sheep, you've only got those particular type dung beetles. If you've got pigs, cattle, sheep, and all the other things that are going on, then you get a whole lot of other dung beetles. That's a picture that Ted Green took. He reckoned 2.5 weeks after it had come out of a horse, and it was still killing dung beetles. So last but not least is how it all functions in terms of money. Coming right to the end now. This is a partial budget. So those of you who went to Cirencester, I spent at least a year of my life doing partial budgets. And so you look at the enterprise, farming enterprise in this instance, and you then look at all its assets, and you then work out what those assets could be doing differently that could give you a different income stream, and then you can work out if the change is worth doing. So this is a partial budget with six particular points of interest in terms of money. We receive an enormous £220,000 a year from environmental stewardship. Now that's about to go. So we're about to go into CS, and then we hope that elms will be favourable to us in the future as well. So that's that pocket. This is going. So £200,000 we will be missing in 7 years' time. It will be gone altogether. It'll at the moment this is what we're thinking, and we don't know what's going to happen, but this is what we think is going to happen. So that money is going to be going. And that money was going back in 2003. We were told back in 2003 the basic payment would be shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and it would disappear. And back in 2003, I took that as gospel. I had no idea that it would never happen and we'd just carry on getting that money. So I then started to think about what we would do differently. And that was part of the reason for going into what we've done. Using the land and its landscape in tune with itself rather than trying to force it to do things that it didn't want to do. So one of the things we did is we've converted about 223,000 foot of farm buildings, 230 new jobs being created in those little buildings. So we've lost 11 people on the farm, 230 locals are now working in these little units and businesses on the land. And that brings in 620,000 a year. Because you haven't got to have the farm manager anymore, you haven't got to have the dairyman or the relief milker or the key personnel, you've released 7 cottages, and that's bringing in a rent. So that brings in 120,000 a year. We produce 75 tonnes live weight of organic free-range meat. And that's worth about 120,000 to us a year. And we're going to concentrate on that for the next 5 years. We're going to try to build a business around that meat. We're going to try to put $500,000 on that account. That's the sort of goal and aim. The tourism business I wasn't at all sure about, and we only did it the last 5 years because people kept on telling me you've got to give it a go because it probably is going to be an important part of your future. I had absolutely no idea that it would be so successful. It's a 20-30% margin business. It's we turned over last year 450,000. I just got a report in yesterday from the team. The safaris for next year, we've sold £150,000 worth of safaris next year. Now, money in, 100% up front, for something we're going to be servicing in October next year. Astonishing. I just can't get my head around it. I don't know, is that what all tourist businesses work like? I have no idea, but it's absolutely astonishing. So when you're being invited to come to Knepp, don't. Hold off. But that whole picture there means that when you put us in comparison with the national average for the Savills benchmarking, we're talking about profits of £800 an acre compared to £133 an acre. This is so much more profitable than the national average. It's completely different. It's just using your assets in a different way and thinking about what works with your land, what works with your land. A lot of things have come from doing this and the joy of coming to this part of the world and saying hi to you guys, but also it's given me an enormous amount of time. It's meant that I haven't been able to, I don't now wait for that bloody call from the bank manager, which is going to come every month because I know that the overdraft has gone the wrong way. It's a different time. It gives you back time to think about other things. If you're not fighting to stay alive, then you've got time to do other stuff. And so what I'm doing now is all this stuff. So we're creating the Yellowstone National Park of Europe. We're buying up a whole mountain range in the southern Carpathians, and we're keeping those wolves and bears and those lynx and everything going. The Endangered Landscape Programme is funded by Arcadia. I sit on the board of Arcadia. We give 120 million a year away. Half of it goes to conservation. And part of that conservation goes into the Endangered Landscape Programme, which is set up to promote these sorts of projects. So there is a fund there now that will pay for. The RSPB has got an amazing project up in the Cairngorms called Cairngorms Connect. They've done it with the Scottish Government and with a local landowner, and they're doing a huge 260,000 hectare project up in the Cairngorms. So these are the sort of things I'm now involved in, the really exciting stuff, the going out and actually making change, making a difference to the world. Well, most of you, there wasn't anyone buying my book, Izzy's book, so I know that you've all bought it anyway. So that's it. So questions.
Hi, thank you so much for such an inspirational presentation. I don't know if I missed something, but there was the A, the B, the C parts, and you said that the top part, the grassland suppressed the regrowth of trees and scrub, but in the bottom part, you showed how that regenerated. So what was the difference? Because it looked to me like it was grassland on the bit that regenerated as well, but maybe I missed something.
So the southern block, we came out of arable over a 6-year period. So we took, the worst fields we stopped growing arable crops in. I'm getting definitely. So we stopped growing arable crops in the worst bits of the land and just left the field alone. So it was stubble to whatever was going to come. And then you did that for 6 years, and by the end, in 2006, we had 100 acres of barley left, and that was, combine went through that and then just left. And so it was just from stubble to whatever was going to fall. The seed that was going to rain down, the seed bank seed, that's what then came. Whereas the other bits were all reseeded with grasses. So you put in your swards, you establish your grassland, which then just stops all of that huge explosion of scrub and trees. Just slows it right down. Takes 20 years off it.
Okay, just because of the sort of the competition with the roots of the grasses prevents, or do the grasses kind of stifle the trees as they grow?
I think all of that. I mean, just imagine, the seed is raining in from over periods of time. So the stubble takes quite a long time to start to cover up. So you maybe have 9-10 months where it's pretty open still. So you can imagine that all the seed that is flying around in the spring is going to keep on recruiting. Whereas in grassland, where's it going? It's going to sit on the surface. It's not going to even touch the soil. So it's that recruitment just didn't happen.
Thank you.
I was fascinated to read in the book the scepticism and downright hostility from your neighbours on the initial stages, particularly in view of the financial advantage that you seem to be presenting here. Has that changed now? Is it changing?
It's been difficult, isn't it? Because if you're trying to promote an idea, you maybe tread on a whole load of people's toes. You're saying, in effect, you're wrong, I'm right. Because in arguing for something, you've got to come up with an argument that sounds half sensible to you at least. And by doing that, you're creating a threat. Now, it's a perceived threat. I mean, I'm not threatening anyone. I mean, I'm on my own land, on my own enterprise, I'm doing my own thing. I'm promoting these ideas as something that's worth doing because they have been worth doing, because the success is worth getting. So it's been really difficult in terms of the farming community to understand what the hell you're up to. I had a wagon load of NFU guys in the early days, maybe 5-6 years into the project. And there I was standing in my field with, ragwort, creeping thistle, scrub everywhere, and they were going, what the hell is this guy on? Because actually, how do you describe stuff to people? How do you take them on a journey of your thinking? And it's sort of very difficult, isn't it? You can say, well, can't you see that this hawthorn will one day be a little tree? And just describing changes in landscapes is very, very difficult. So now we're really pleased because we employed a young man to take on the role of pulling together our neighbours, us included, pulling us together with all our neighbours into a group of farmers. And we've got now 5,500 hectares that have signed up into that group. And we hope to be part of that group in deciding a new future for all of us. And I'll be saying what we've been doing, and all of these other people have their own ideas about what they are willing to do and what they're willing to contribute, and and so on. So it'll be a really interesting next few years of discussion of where we go as a region.
Thank you. Charlie, that was fabulous. It's so inspiring. Thank you very much for the example. My name's Kerry. I was on Dieter Helm's Natural Capital Committee for the first few years, and now I'm a colleague of Kevin's on the RSPB board. The way you explained how you stacked up these different land uses with a different income, could you please just talk a little bit about how you think it might work for smaller land holdings that perhaps couldn't be running their own safari or whatever? Do you think that individual changes in land use and one or perhaps two of those different forms of payment might be enough to create a proper incentive for people to make the changes?
It's been one of the really major things that we can't quite get our heads around, isn't it? Scale. And the smaller your land holding, a few hundred quid isn't going to make a difference. And so, so one of the ideas that we were talking about in Rewilding Britain was you would have a super payment. If you were allowing beavers back onto your land and you lost 1/4 of an acre of productive land, then what should you be paid to have those beavers as guests on your land? And you were having to then think, actually, you'd have to be quite a lot of money to make any difference at all to the perception of allowing those beavers back on your land. And so it is a problem, isn't it? It's a real problem with scale. So I love this movement of group farms and cluster farm thinking, because I think that gives us an opportunity. One of the projects I'm working with in Norfolk is going to be, 3 or 4, 5,000, 6,000 acres. But it's made up of a whole lot of different owners all clubbing together on a valley system. And they've all got different stakes in it. But collectively, what they are thinking of doing is having a tourism business within that area. And that tourism business will be utilising all of that area. So there should be a distribution of the money made on that to everyone in that area. I'm guessing, for us, we've got 2 neighbours that put land into our project, and all we do is we've got 260 acres in the north that's added to our block up there, and we just divide per rata for the acreage put in the profits. So it's just very simple. You put in 200 acres, we've got 700 acres, the whole thing, and you just do it very simply. And that makes sense for them because they're getting the added benefits of the larger scale. But it's difficult. It's a difficult one. It's going to be, and this the pilot scheme for elms is going to be really crucial, isn't it? Actually teasing out what you're going to have to do on the smaller scale to get that functioning working.
So I've got 2 small questions. One is, how do you collect the animals so that you can comply with the regulations around monitoring them? And then the other question was, forgive me if I missed this in the book, but I understood that sheep weren't very good for the biodiversity. Can you tell me why sheep are not good?
I think the sheep bit is I didn't want to have sheep running around bramble. And if you have sheep in bramble, you know what happens. They just get caught up in bramble, and you spend your entire life picking them out of bramble. So sheep in that sort of system, it was just too scary a thought. We would spend our entire times being a shepherd again, rather than allowing free roaming animals to really do their stuff. So that was my fear about sheep. Sheep also, as you know, target quite successfully flowering plants. So they will look at the flowering heads, and they will take that little bit of sweetness within a sward before anything else. So and the other thought I suppose with sheep is they are Mesopotamian. Then lowland Britain was unlikely to have had a goat or a sheep type species on it. It may have had it on the rocky cliffs in the coastal areas, but in your muddy clay bits, you probably aren't going to have anything like that. So it's again a little bit of a feeling that you're going to use animals that are proxies, yes, but proxies that maybe you would find in that landscape. The second question is that sort of two things here, is that Pat, the stockman, has learnt how to perform the rituals of a guy called Bud Williams. Have you ever come across Bud Williams? So Bud died about 5 years ago, and Bud's an American. And you can ring up Eunice in I think she's in Kansas, and Eunice will send you the videos of Bud doing his budding, and it is astonishing. He was able, so imagine you lot were Wapiti, and he said, and you said to him, I want that Wapiti out of that herd. He would be able to get that Wapiti out of that herd in an open field. So he was that sort of, you know. Anyway, so budding is what we do. So taking Pat 3 years to learn the technique of Bud Williams, and now he can move our animals through landscapes that really we were struggling before. Before we were going out with maybe 8 people with quads and horses and, you know, chasing animals through scrub. And that was really, it wasn't right. It was not only not right about the animal, but it was also scary footpaths and all the rest of it. So it wasn't going to be a thing we can carry on doing. So now Pat will go out, find a little herd somewhere within the scrub. He will then start to move them. And long as they just walk away and they start bellowing and they pick up their calves and the whole herd then starts moving. It doesn't matter which direction. You get them moving gently. You then start to get all the other cattle, for instance, dropping in like bits of mercury. And they flow in to this noise that's walking through the landscape. And in 2.5 hours, you'll walk them in, and you walk them maybe 4 or 5 miles, and you'll get them into your pen. And used to be charging around desperately, thinking that, oh gosh, the TB guy's coming in 2 days' time. We've got to have them in. But now it's just a gentle movement, and you're just moving.
Does
through.
it work the same for the sheep and same for the pigs and the deer?
No, the deer are just shot. You're just shooting the deer, so you're not trying to look after them in the same way. They're considered a wild animal in this instance. So over 500 acres, in enclosed areas over 500 acres, they're considered to be feral. So you don't have to look after them the same way. They're not a farm animal. And the pigs you've got to build a trap, and then you've got to coax them into. If they're hungry, you certainly don't do this time of year. You've got to wait till the acorn mass is gone and they started to get hungry again. Maybe in January you can then start to then coax them into traps, and then you can got them, and then you can just remove them from the site.
Can I just say, we've done a rewilding site at the moment, and Derek's done his rewilding site, but between us, if we wanted to link up, there's a big obstacle, and that is Dartmoor National Park. So I'm just wondering how you affect the changes on Dartmoor, and how we can link up together, but sort of challenge Dartmoor National Park when their thinking is that human sort of social interaction is the most important priority in their books at the moment.
For me, all these things work on stories and storylines.
We've got Chris Giles here from Dartmoor.
So I'm guessing it's that shifting baseline syndrome. If you can tell stories of what Dartmoor used to have, the curlew, all the stuff that you can fill that storyline with of what it was. That's the most part. For me, that's the one that convinced me that you've got to change. You've got to do something. Don't know what that is, but you've got to do something to bring back life. So storylines, I think, probably and national trusts, national parks are obviously really interested in stories because that's what they're about. They need to have those stories to then convince everyone about a new future for that landscape. I'm not going to go any further than that because I have no idea what I'm talking about.
I'm just conscious that there's unprecedented pressure at the moment on the countryside that we're seeing intensively around all parts. How can we persuade and encourage government to see this as something necessary, positive and productive, instead of being tempted to snap compulsorily purchase farms and development. There seems to be a huge conflict. You see it around Cambridge. There is, on the one hand, there's a proposal to rewild and reintroduce fenland, isn't there, from somewhere like Wickham Fen right to Cambridge. On the other hand, there is this intense pressure on that area for development. How are we going to reconcile these priorities, and how seriously can we hope that the local and national governments are going to take the whole issue of climate change and the need to address plummeting biodiversity and all the rest of it? Sorry, big question.
Read Dieter's book and the Natural Capital Committee's work on it. It is, you're talking about the most complex thing. That's we're talking about another 10 million people by 2050. Where they're going to live. And it really is beyond my pay grade, this. I mean, it really is. But I found Dieter's book really interesting about this particular subject. It's actually trying to work out the numbers. How do you physically do this and get that landscape feeding and giving us space for nature? And how do you do it? How does it function? And I think, well, the answer is you've got to break a lot of eggs and change whole systems, and that's probably not going to happen, is it? Look at where we are now and how close our Parliament is probably going to be for the next generation. How are we going to make any decisions? I don't know. It is, and it's a really interesting point, isn't it? But I mean, again, it is way beyond my pay grade. I think I'm a simple landowner from Wales.
David? Sorry, Jackie and then...
Hi. I think what you've done at Knepp is wonderful, and I think we're blessed in Devon because we have some wonderful landscapes. And I guess I get a sense that most of the people in this room feel quite smug because they're already doing what they can for wildlife, and they're a very caring group. Have you any experience of having a room full of one life, live it young farmers with big John Deere tractors? And what would their reaction be if you have? I really enjoyed the chapter on rewilding the soil, and Isabella pointed out that it's actually quite a waste of money to put on artificial fertiliser sometimes. So I didn't know whether you'd had any experience of
and so
converting young...
So next Friday I'm going to the AGM of Hampshire, and on the Monday I'm going to the AGM of the Dorset NFU. Last week I was in front of 90 farmers down in East Sussex. It's a different audience, isn't it? But it's still, I mean, absolutely, So I was just outside of Oxford with a farmer that had about 5,000 acres, and he had two areas, and I was talking to him about regenerative agriculture. Never heard of it. I was talking to him about natural capital, ecosystem services. Never heard of it. I didn't get to Greta Thunberg and find out if that was on his radar or not. But the answer is there's a on the next door estate of ours, there's a 160-acre farm farmed by a lovely man who takes kids around his farm, and he's got turtle doves and he's got nightingales and he's got reds in his streams where the sea trout are coming up and spawning. He's lovely, and he's got this really wonderful story to tell about food production, his sheep and his cows and his veg patch and all the rest of it. Sort of darling buds of May sort of stuff. He is now telling me that the young farmers coming through wouldn't be able to tell you the species of the trees in the landscape. We're talking about oak, ash. Wouldn't be able to tell you the name. So, that's a bigger problem than I'm talking about here. That's a whole educational system, and that's a whole parent. What are the parents saying? What do they know? So, it's a difficult one, isn't it? But then on the other hand, you go along to groundswell. I don't know if you've heard of groundswell. It's a new. It's been going about 3 or 4 years. The Cherry brothers set up this conference a few years ago promoting conservation agriculture, and I went along to it this year, and there was 2,500 farmers. A friend of mine calls them Taliban farmers, but I wouldn't dare use that.
Thank you for your really inspiring presentation and for all the effort and work that you're doing to help us all. I wasn't planning to mention this, but you did in your presentation. You had 3 characters in there, HS2, and you also put the combined cost of HS2 and Crossrail in as about 100 billion, but HS2 on its own is going to cost more than 100 billion now, as we know. I had the privilege of questioning Dieter Helm about this at the Hay Festival together with Tony Juniper, and at that time he couldn't form an opinion, despite the fact that he mentioned it more times in his book than the common house sparrow. So he has since refined his view, and I think it's fair to say that he doesn't support HS2. A short story, the narrative on HS2 is it's going to take over £100 billion of taxpayers' money, destroy over 100 ancient woodlands in order to massively expand airports. So we've had the Heathrow Express, the Gatwick Express. HS2 is going to be the Birmingham Express, the Manchester Express and the Leeds Express. The grand plan of HS2 is truly catastrophic. So I guess after giving you those facts, and maybe you might want to update the budget in your presentation as well to maybe double that figure. What do you think of HS2? And, just to be serious, in the face of this general election, we probably have the best opportunity to get this project scrapped right now, to help educate our MPs that this should really be a very, very big defining voting decision moment, because that £100 billion of our money probably represents the best opportunity we have got to kickstart the clean economy that we need in the face of our climate and ecological emergency. That was a question, by the way. Thanks.
I love HS2. God, it will be fantastic. We will be able to build this corridor running right the way up from London to Birmingham. And as long as we give enough land, we'll have one of my incredible, rewilded landscapes, a kilometre either side of the railway. And my God, that will connect all nature up through that dreadful bit of the... How can I answer that? How can I? I don't know. I'm with you on all of it. I mean, I was using the 100 billion as an example of just how much money do you think... 3 or 4 years ago, I saw this figure of 56 billion was being spent in the last decade controlling non-native invasive species in North America. 56 billion spent on controlling non-native species. How many successes did they have?
No.
0. 56 billion spent on 0 result seemed to me to be completely bonkers. And 100 billion on a railway cutting 15 minutes off a journey, bonkers. But we're going to spend it.
Charlie. Hi, Charlie. I'm sorry. If you look at Groundswell, they were very keen on rotational grazing. Do you think that your longhorns naturally rotational graze? And also, of course, they're outwintered. You want to get more production from your meat. So, is the extra photosynthesis which takes place if you are rotationally grazing important for you? And also, do you think that outwintering cattle on Dartmoor and rotationally grazing them would be a possibility?
So at the moment, what we're doing is in farming terms, is set stocking. So you've got a set amount of stock within a paddock system, and that's, you know, they can go anywhere they want, and any time of the year they can be anywhere. We are seeing a movement of these herds around the system. We put GPS collars on a number of animals, and we see hotspots appearing where they spend a lot more time than other areas. So there's lots of failures in that, and we know, you know, we know what we know now, and I didn't know 20 years ago about all this work on the mob grazing and this idea of allowing areas to rest and all the rest of it. So, yeah, what we're doing is what we're doing, and we're going to carry on doing that because we need to know what the long-term effect of that is. But I think the next system, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of the invisible fencing that the Americans came up with and the Norwegians came up with, where you just draw a polygon on Google Earth and you can move that polygon around a landscape, and that's your invisible fencing, and you train your animal, your grazing animal, to respond to a noise as that invisible fencing approaches the animal, or the other way around. Now the RSPB have got two projects running. They've got already a herd that's already been trained under that system, and they've got a herd in training on that system. So I think one of the really interesting things for the next step for someone, and it may be the RSPB at Wicken or wherever it's going to be, is to actually then play around with that idea that you can actually move the animals around the landscape with this invisible fencing, and you can then create your mob grazing and your increase in productivity perhaps. But one of the things that we are for sure not doing is going to be driven to more productivity. We are not going to be, the byproduct of the whole project is meat. It's not the primary product, not the primary output. And if you think like that, then you stop always chasing, you've got to have more and more of it. It's only a byproduct. You know, we are getting £220,000 a year from government via Europe for doing what we're doing for nature. It's not about producing the meat. And we get 120,000 a year for the meat. That's a big chunk of money. And we want to turn that into $500,000. And we can do that. We may not make any more money because it may cost us the difference to actually sell it, but that's what we want to do. We want to feel that we are selling our meat to our customers, to our people that love us.
Charlie, thank you for the talk. Fantastic. I've been to Knepp and it was absolutely inspirational. We are regenerative farmers, pasture-fed, up on the top of Dartmoor. The thing that worries me most of all at the moment is how can all these lovely people here enter into a conversation that will make a difference with the likes of the NFU, that have this incredible power over government for the future of our food, and what will happen with trades and tariffs. Have you got any suggestions, please?
One thing is for sure, you want to work with everyone, not become antagonistic, or, you know, everyone's got a point of view, everyone's got a different bit of land, everyone's got a different farming system, everyone's got their own idea, and you just need to keep on talking about what you're doing and why you think it's interesting, or why it may be a positive way to think about things. I don't think you can, you know, all of this has to come from the bottom up, isn't it? There's nothing that you can do which is going to be top down to change things really in the end of the day. It's all going to be bottom up. And that's just knowledge, that's just gaining more and more knowledge and insights into, you know, my meeting this morning with this farmer in Bridport, wow, I just learned, you know, everything he said I learned more. So, you know, I think you just have to be that open and just keep on talking about what you're doing and what your experiences are and the stories you tell, and that can help. I'm late for my next date.
Do you want to? Right. Charlie has to get on. As you know, Isabella is giving a talk in Exeter, and then they'll be travelling back together.
Well, I just want to say I think we've had a fantastic and inspirational talk. I mean, it was just tremendous. So thank you, Charlie. I think the challenge you've given us, you know, is around Knepp and what we can do and what you're doing to tackle the biggest threats that we face as humanity at the moment around biodiversity loss and climate change. And I think you have a solution. You have one solution here. there are others, and we're all going to face this and tackle it in our own ways. But thank you so much for sharing with us. It's been really